The silence that followed the last shot was more deafening than any explosion. It was a dense, heavy silence, laden with the echo of screams and the metallic smell of fear. For David, a 16-year-old black teenager with skin as dark as ebony and eyes that, once full of life, now reflected a terrifying emptiness, that silence became the soundtrack of his new reality. He was hidden under a desk, his body trembling uncontrollably, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. David was a promising young man with an easy smile and a natural talent for mathematics, but the innocence of his youth had been shattered into 1,000 pieces that day. He was a survivor, but survival came at a price, an invisible wound bleeding in his soul. His mother, Maria, was a black woman in her early 40s, with hands calloused by work and a gaze that carried the constant worry of a single mother in an underserved community. Maria was the personification of silent strength and faith, who had fought her whole life to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table for David and his younger sister, Sophia. She worked tirelessly as a cleaner in a hospital, and her greatest wish was to see her children prosper, far from the violence and hardships she had faced. Sophia, David's 12-year-old sister, was a cheerful and curious girl with colorful braids and an indomitable spirit. She idolized David, and her contagious energy was a constant reminder to him of the beauty of life, even amidst adversity. The news of the shooting at Northwood High School spread like wildfire. Chaos engulfed the streets, desperate parents rushing towards the school, sirens echoing in the air. Maria arrived at the scene with her heart in her throat, her mind flooded with terrifying images. She searched for David amidst the crowd, her eyes scanning every face, every body, until she finally found him, sitting on a sidewalk, pale, in shock, but alive. The relief was overwhelming, but the joy was quickly replaced by deep concern. David was not the same. His eyes were empty, his voice a whisper, and his body an empty shell. The days that followed were a blur of nightmares, insomnia, and isolation. David locked himself in his room, refusing to go out, to eat, to talk. The sound of a slamming door, the noise of a car in the street, a dog's bark, everything startled him, taking him back to that terrible day. He relived the moments of the shooting repeatedly, the screams, the gunshots, the smell of gunpowder. Post-traumatic stress, like a dense fog, enveloped him, suffocating his ability to feel, to connect with the world around him. He felt guilty for having survived, for having left his friends behind, and the guilt gnawed at him from within. Maria tried everything to help him. She hugged him, whispered words of love and encouragement, tried to make him talk. But David was in a dark place where light could not reach him. Sophia, with her innocence, tried to cheer him up, inviting him to play, to watch a movie, to talk. But David pushed her away. His pain was so great that he could not bear his sister's joy. He felt like a burden to his family, and the idea that he was causing them pain only increased his own anguish. Maria knew David needed professional help, but the healthcare system in the United States was a bureaucratic and expensive labyrinth. She had no health insurance, and the few resources she had were barely enough for the basic household expenses. She called hospitals, clinics, mental health centers, but the answer was always the same: long waiting lists, exorbitant costs, and the need for health insurance. The frustration was immense, and the feeling of powerlessness overwhelming. She watched her son sinking deeper and deeper, and she didn't know what to do. One day, Maria heard about a community clinic that offered low-cost mental health services. She called immediately, and to her surprise, managed to get an appointment for David. Hope, which seemed to have faded, lit a small flame in her heart. She knew the journey would be long and arduous, but she was willing to fight for her son, for her family, for a future where healing was possible, even after tragedy. The fight against trauma and the system was just beginning, and Maria, with her unwavering strength, was ready to face it. The first visit to the community clinic was a mix of relief and frustration. Dr. Mendez, a middle-aged Latino therapist with a gentle face and a compassionate gaze, received David with a calmness that contrasted with the teenager's internal turmoil. Dr. Mendez was a dedicated professional who had witnessed firsthand the impact of violence on the mental health of young people in underserved communities. He was a man of empathy, who believed in the human capacity for healing, and who saw in David not just a patient, but a young man with immense potential to be rescued. His morality was guided by compassion, and he was determined to help David find his way back to the light. The sessions with Dr. Mendez were a safe space for David. There, he could talk about his fears, his nightmares, his guilt. The therapist listened attentively, without judgment, without rush. He helped him process the trauma, understand that his reactions were normal, and develop strategies to cope with anxiety and depression. David began to open up, to share his experiences, to cry the tears he had held back for so long. With each session, a little of the weight on his chest seemed to lessen, and a small flame of hope began to glow in his heart. However, David's healing journey was constantly sabotaged by the system. The community clinic, despite its efforts, could not meet the growing demand for mental health services. Maria, in her tireless searches, spent hours on the phone trying to schedule new appointments, battling bureaucracy and the indifference of health insurance companies. She discovered that without adequate health insurance, options were minimal and costs were prohibitive. Hospitals, which should have been sanctuaries of healing, became another obstacle. When David had a severe panic attack, Maria rushed him to the emergency room. There, they were met with suspicious glances and intrusive questions. The nurse, a middle-aged white woman with a tired expression and an impatient tone of voice, seemed more concerned with paperwork than with David's suffering. She was the personification of bureaucracy, a woman who had become insensitive to the pain of others, hardened by the system. "Do you have insurance? Who is going to pay for this?" Her words were like a slap in Maria's face, making her feel humiliated and powerless. David was attended by a doctor who seemed more interested in prescribing medication than in understanding the root of his suffering. He felt like a number, a case to be dispatched, and not a human being seeking help. The hospital experience only increased his distrust of the healthcare system, and he refused to go back, even when Maria pleaded. Maria, however, did not give up. She joined support groups for parents of gun violence victims, where she found other mothers who shared her pain and frustrations. There, she learned about the challenges of the healthcare system, about racial discrimination and access to treatment, and about the importance of fighting for their rights. She became an activist, participating in community meetings, organizing petitions, and using her voice to denounce the injustices of the system. She discovered that many health insurance companies refused to cover mental health treatments or limited the number of sessions, making recovery a luxury for the few. She heard stories of families who had lost everything to pay for expensive treatments, of young people who had been abandoned by the system, and of lives that had been lost due to lack of access to adequate treatment. The reality was cruel, but Maria refused to accept it. With the support of Dr. Mendez and the support groups, Maria began to formulate a plan. She researched assistance programs, looked for pro bono lawyers, and explored all possible options to ensure David received the treatment he deserved. She knew the fight would be long and arduous, that the system was powerful, but she was determined to win. She fought not only for David, but for all young people who, like him, were victims of a system that marginalized and abandoned them. The light at the end of the tunnel seemed distant, but Maria, with her unwavering strength, was willing to walk there, step by step, for her son, for her family, for a future where mental health was a right, not a privilege.
Maria's persistence and Dr. Mendez's dedication began to bear fruit. David, though still reluctant, started attending therapy sessions more regularly. Dr. Mendez, with his patient and empathetic approach, was slowly unraveling the layers of trauma and pain that enveloped the teenager. He encouraged him to express his feelings, to name his fears, to confront the memories that haunted him. David began to realize that he was not alone in his struggle, that there were people who cared and who were willing to help him find his way back. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of access to continuous and specialized treatment. The community clinic, despite its efforts, could not meet the growing demand for mental health services. Maria, in her tireless searches, discovered a support program for victims of gun violence maintained by a nonprofit organization. There, she met Mrs. Johnson, a Black social worker with a soft voice and a welcoming gaze, who had dedicated her life to helping families like hers. Mrs. Johnson was the personification of hope, a woman who had transformed her own pain into purpose and who believed in the human capacity for healing. She became an invaluable ally for Maria, guiding her through the bureaucratic labyrinth and connecting her to resources she didn't even know existed. Through Mrs. Johnson, David was referred to a therapy group with other survivors of gun violence. At first, he was skeptical, reluctant to share his experiences with strangers. But upon hearing the stories of other young people who had gone through similar traumas, he began to feel less isolated, less alone. He realized that his pains, his fears, his anxieties were shared, and that there was strength in unity, in mutual understanding. The group became a safe haven for David, a place where he could be himself, without judgment, without the need to hide his wounds. Group sessions were led by an experienced therapist, Mr. Thomas, a middle-aged Black man with a calm voice and a subtle sense of humor. Mr. Thomas was a survivor of gun violence, and his own healing journey made him a compassionate and inspiring guide. He taught them relaxation techniques, mindfulness, how to deal with triggers and flashbacks. He encouraged them to use their voices, to turn their pain into action, to fight for a future where gun violence was no longer a reality. David began to get involved in activities outside of therapy. He joined a math club at school where his natural talent for numbers flourished. He started playing basketball with his friends again, feeling the joy of movement, the camaraderie of the sport. He spent more time with his sister, Sophia, laughing, playing, rediscovering the beauty of life. The light in his eyes, which had faded, began to shine again, and his smile, once forced, was now genuine. Maria, seeing David's improvement, felt immense relief. She continued her fight against the system, participating in community meetings, talking to legislators, and advocating for universal access to mental health treatment. She became a powerful voice, an inspiration to other mothers facing similar challenges. She knew the battle was long, but she was determined to win, not only for David, but for all young people who, like him, deserved a chance at healing and a full life.
David's journey, from a traumatized and isolated young man to a passionate advocate, was a testament to the human capacity to transform pain into purpose. Individual therapy sessions with Dr. Mendez and group meetings with Mr. Thomas and other survivors had planted in him a seed of activism, a deep understanding that his experience, however painful, could be a powerful tool for change. He had found his voice and was determined to use it to amplify the voices of those who, like him, had been silenced by violence. David began to actively participate in community meetings and awareness events about gun violence. He spoke about his experience, about the devastating impact of the shooting on his life and his family's life. His words were simple, but charged with raw emotion and an authenticity that touched people's hearts. He did not speak as a politician or an expert, but as a survivor, a young man who had seen the darkest side of violence and who was determined to prevent others from going through the same. He connected with other school shooting survivors, forming a network of support and activism. Together, they organized peaceful protests, peace marches, and fundraising campaigns to support victims of gun violence. They became a movement, a united force demanding change, calling for stricter gun control laws and more investment in violence prevention programs. David, with his calmness and eloquence, emerged as a natural leader, a spokesperson for a generation that refused to accept violence as an inevitable reality. Maria, his mother, was his biggest supporter and tireless partner in the fight. She accompanied him to every event, every meeting, every protest. She spoke about the difficulties of accessing mental health treatment, about racial discrimination in the healthcare system, and about the need to ensure that all victims of violence had the necessary support to heal. She became a powerful voice for mothers who had lost their children to gun violence, and her passion and determination inspired everyone around her. Sophia, David's sister, though younger, also got involved in the cause. She created artworks that depicted the impact of gun violence, using her creativity to express the pain and hope of her generation. Her paintings and drawings were powerful, touching people's hearts and generating important conversations about the topic. She became an activist artist, using her art as a form of protest and awareness. David and his family's activism did not go unnoticed. They were invited to speak at national conferences, to meet with legislators, and to share their story with the media. They became a symbol of hope for many families who had been affected by gun violence, and their courage and resilience inspired everyone to stand up and fight for a safer and more just future. However, the struggle was arduous. The opposition was strong, and gun control laws were a controversial and polarizing topic. David and his allies faced resistance from powerful lobbying groups, from politicians who prioritized money and power over human life, and from a society that, at times, seemed indifferent to the pain and suffering of victims. But they refused to give up. They knew that change was possible, and that every small victory was a step towards a better future. David, in his journey of healing and activism, discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. He had transformed his pain into power, his vulnerability into resilience. He had found a purpose in his life, a reason to fight, to inspire, to lead. He was a survivor, a warrior, and his voice, united with other voices, was becoming a powerful chorus calling for justice, for peace, for a future where the trauma of the bullet was no longer a reality. The fight continued, but David knew he was not alone, and that hope, however fragile it seemed, was an unbreakable force.
Years passed, and David, once a teenager haunted by trauma, had transformed into a man. He graduated from college with honors, dedicating his life to the cause that had saved him. His voice, once a whisper, now echoed on national and international stages, inspiring millions to join the fight against gun violence and for equitable access to mental health. He became a lawyer, using his knowledge of the system to fight for fairer laws and policies that protected victims and prevented future tragedies. His mother, Maria, was his greatest inspiration and tireless partner. She continued her fight for access to mental health treatment for underserved communities, founding a nonprofit organization in David's name, which offered free therapy and support to young people and families affected by violence. She became a prominent figure in the movement, a powerful voice for mothers who had lost their children, and a tireless advocate for social justice. Her smile, once tired, now radiated a strength and determination that inspired everyone around her. Sophia, David's sister, followed in his footsteps, becoming a renowned artist whose artworks depicted the beauty and resilience of the Black community and the impact of gun violence. Her exhibitions were more than art. They were a call to action, a way to raise awareness and inspire change. She used her art as a tool for healing, for hope, for building a future where violence no longer had a place. Dr. Mendez and Mr. Thomas, the therapists who had guided David on his healing journey, continued to work tirelessly, helping other young people process their traumas and find their way back to the light. They saw in David a living proof that healing was possible even after tragedy, and that support and empathy could transform lives. David never forgot the day of the shooting, nor the pain it had caused. But he did not allow the trauma to define him. He transformed it into fuel, into purpose, into a legacy of hope and change. He became a mentor to other survivors, a guide to those who were lost in the darkness of trauma. He taught them that healing was not a destination, but a journey, and that every step, no matter how small, was a victory.
His story, The Bullet Trauma, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that mental health is a right and that healing is possible even after tragedy. It echoed throughout the country, inspiring millions to join the fight against gun violence and for equitable access to mental health. David, the young man who had survived a shooting, had become a warrior, an advocate, a beacon of hope for a generation that refused to accept violence as an inevitable reality. His legacy was not just his own healing, but the healing of a community, of a nation that through his story found the strength to fight for a safer, more just, and more humane future.